thank you for coming to my favorite bookstore in New York City. So can we show love? Yeah. They publish amazing things, they print amazing things, and they do amazing events like this, and I'm so grateful to them. They're awesome. I'd like to thank the barkeep and cocktail designer. I married him because he makes tasty stuff. Always has done. So drink that till it's gone. We don't want to carry it.
We'll do our best.
Yeah, well played. So as I always do, I'd like to give maybe a little bit of historical context for the novel, and then I'm going to read a tiny bit of it, and then I like to get to the Q&A directly because you guys are always much more interesting than I am in terms of your questions. As you're aware, Seven for a Secret is the sequel to The Gods of Gotham, and that is the book that set up Timothy Wilde and Valentine Wilde as copper stars in the inaugural NYPD. And I've very often been asked the same question about The Gods of Gotham, so I'll answer that one right off the bat. What led me to write it? And I always tend to say that I think that origin stories are mythologically resonant. I think that we want to know how Sherlock Holmes met John Watson. Well, like a lot of us here already know that. but we want to know what Superman's childhood was like. 6, don't we? I mean, we want to know what led Batman to put on the suit with the nipples and the pointy ears and the black rubber thing and become a vigilante justice hero, right? So since I write hero stories, I started with Day 1, Cop 1 of the NYPD, and his name is Timothy Wilde, and so that's what led me to write it. If you haven't read The Gods of Gotham, and God knows you don't need to have done, all you need to understand the world of the mid-1840s New York City is that in the year 1800, the census recorded 60,000 people in New York, and in the year 1850, it recorded 500,000 people in New York. So there was no infrastructure to support the giant influx of people. It was a total cow town at the time. There were still literally cattle drives up Broadway. And if you add to this the very salient fact that something terrible happened to the potatoes in Ireland in 1845, then you're led to a hot mess, essentially. Manhattan was a hot mess of starving people. I have this as a note. That's basically what it was. They were a hot mess of starving people. They were extremely hostile in their views toward each other because there weren't a lot of ways to survive and to get past the problems inherent in the city. So it was blacks versus whites, it was Protestants versus Catholics, it was natives versus Irish. They were basically all just sort of fighting each other for food, luchador style, just like picking up chairs and attacking people. They were not in a position to consult anyone in terms of a social sort of safety net, because that didn't exist either. So your closest thing to a social safety net was Tammany Hall. So the plot of Seven for a Secret specifically deals with the horrifying practice that I came across in my historical research of the systematic and deliberate kidnapping of free Northern Americans of color. And more on that in 1 second, but let me talk about the title first. Because happily there are no spoilers in the title. You've all seen it. And I'd like it to be a spoiler-free chat. The title's taken from a really old children's poem about counting blackbirds. So it's one of those like truly creepy children's poems that you hear chanted at the beginning of like Korean horror films. like Ring Around the Rosie, that sort of thing. And I'll read it for you. The poem went 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So some of you are probably thinking, cool, Lyndsay, I know the Counting Crows are like one of your favorite bands. You're obsessed with 90s music. Like, it's neat. Adam Duritz has really hot dreads. Yes, it's true. But why would you name a book after Adam Duritz? That's creepy. But in fact, in antebellum New York, there was an elaborate system, if you've read Gods of Gotham, of slang dialect that was called flash powder. And that was in use among the underclasses, and the slave catchers who traveled north for fun and profit were called blackbirders. in flash pattern. So the title refers to specifically the blackbirders who hunted down free people of color and the 7 major African American characters who appear in the novel. So a little context. In 1846, when 7 for Secret takes place, blacks are, of course, they're an enslaved race in the South, and they are an extremely disenfranchised set of people in the North, more so than today. It is, for instance, white men could vote if they were citizens, and black men could only vote if they were citizens who also could prove that they had at least $200 worth of property. That was a ludicrous figure at the time. There wasn't a middle class, per se, and most white working class people didn't have $200 of property. So for that to be a voting, hurdle to get over was ridiculous. And one of the things I think is probably going to shock a few people about this book when they pick it up is that Northerners we kind of like to think of ourselves as the Civil War's freedom fighters. A little bit, right? And like it was all about liberty. It was liberty and like patriotism and free cheeseburgers for everybody. And no, that is really, really not how it went down. Historically, 0% of that was the case. The North was absolutely economically complicit where slavery is concerned. And we're all taught in school about the Middle Passage. I think this is important to mention. We're all taught about that triangular trade, right? Where you have African slaves, you have sugar, and then you have rum in this triangular shipping trade, right? The thing we don't talk about very much is the triangular trade existing in the continental United States at the same time. So what was going on was that even apart from the North selling plantation machinery that they designed and that they built, even apart from them selling those tools to the South, the South produced cotton based on the slave economy. And then they sent it to the North, and the North turned it into cloth, cheap cotton, cloth, and then the cloth went to the brand new industrial manufactories, they were called at the time. They turned it into extremely cheap ready-made clothing, and all together now, who did they sell it to? Back to the South. So that was going on, and we don't talk a great deal about that. The North had every reason to fold when it came to the South saying that it wanted to continue the practice of slavery. The blackbirders that I mentioned specifically, they were men who used the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 that George Washington signed into law as a means of making a really revolting profit in human flesh, bearing in mind that the importation of new slaves from Africa was illegal in 1846. So when I say that the importation of new slaves from Africa was illegal in 1846, it was illegal in the way that importing drugs to America is illegal now. You're not allowed to import cocaine into America, so it was exactly as illegal as it was then, okay? So it still happened. But the story of Manhattan, specifically the slave pirate ships, that's a whole other book, so I haven't written that one yet. The kidnapping system, specifically with the blackbirders, worked like this. So a slave escapes down south, or doesn't, because this whole system was based on rampant lies. The slave catchers, or the blackbirders, as they were called, would travel north in pursuit. Then they would land in New York, they would land in Philadelphia maybe, they would go to Boston, and they would simply walk up to a free person of color, and they would point at them and they'd say, "Oh, your name is Coffee, you're from Georgia," clap them in irons, put them on a boat, and send them south of the Mason-Dixon line to be sold. And as terrifying as that scenario already sounds, now register the fact that African Americans were not allowed to testify at fugitive slave identity trials. Legally, that was a huge no-no. So if there even was a trial, your friends and your family couldn't testify as to who you were. So you had to have a white person vouch for you. Wonder how well that went. it didn't go well at all. And the evidence is very, very clear that the police and the judges were entirely complicit in this trade and that they turned, in fact, a hefty profit from it. And it was very disturbing to research. To this end, free blacks in all the major metropolises, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York City specifically, they formed vigilance committees to protect their communities. And in Seven for a Secret specifically, Timothy joins forces with the New York Committee of Vigilance, and that's led by his friend Julius Carpenter, who is a character who's recurring from The Gods of Gotham, and I love him. So the specific female New Yorkers in Seven for a Secret who are battling to free themselves from this ensnarement by blackbirders, they're based on two extremely disturbing true historical accounts, and I'm not going to tell you a word about it because that would spoil the plot. so I won't tell you anything about the historical accounts that they're based on, but maybe later after you've read it. And instead, I'd like to read a really short excerpt from one of my major resources, 12 Years a Slave, which is an autobiography, and it is just being turned into a movie starring Sherlockian connections. But 12 Years a Slave, I'm so happy that this story is being brought to the big screen because Solomon Northrop, his life and his story and his bravery in trying to get home that whole time is just, it was awe-inspiring, and I quote him multiple times in the novel, and I read every word of his autobiography many times because he was a huge badass. So he was a northern gentleman of color, and Solomon Northrop, that was his name. He was drugged, then he was kidnapped, then he was enslaved for 12 years on multiple plantations because he was sold to different ones down south before regaining his freedom. So I'll read a tiny bit from his autobiography. Quote, "The pain in my head had subsided in a measure, but I was very faint and weak. I was sitting upon a low bench made of rough boards and without coat or hat. I was handcuffed. Around my ankles were also a pair of heavy fetters. One end of a chain was fastened to a large ring in the floor, the other to the fetters on my ankles. Waking from such a painful trance, it was some time before I could collect my thoughts. Where was I? What was the meaning of these chains? What had I done to deserve imprisonment in such a dungeon? I could not comprehend. There was a blank of some indefinite period preceding my awakening in that lonely place, the events of which the utmost stretch of memory was unable to recall. I listened intently for some sign or sound of life, but nothing broke the oppressive silence, save the clinking of my chains whenever I chanced to move. I spoke aloud, but the sound of my voice startled me. I felt in my pockets, so far as the fetters would allow, far enough, indeed, to ascertain that I had not only been robbed of liberty, but that my money and free papers were also gone. Then did the idea begin to break upon my mind, at first dim and confused, that I had been kidnapped. But that I thought was incredible. There must have been some misapprehension, some unfortunate mistake. It could not be that a free citizen of New York, who had wronged no man, nor violated any law, should be dealt with thus inhumanly." End quote. So, of course, the harrowing fact was that free citizens of New York were dealt with thus inhumanly very, very often, which is why they started vigilance committees to prevent that fact. By the time Northrop escaped later and returned to his family, he was a grandfather, and, as I said, had spent over a decade enslaved on plantations. The other original resource that I really wanted to mention before I read a short excerpt from Seven for a Secret is the manifesto from the New York Committee of Vigilance, which is founded by Mr. David Ruggles. Oh my God, this guy was amazing. David Ruggles was this incredibly badass African-American abolitionist. He was so cool. And he secured the freedom of an estimated 600 people, we're estimating that now, and he housed Frederick Douglass when Frederick Douglass was on the lam. Frederick Douglass was like, I have to get out of here. He lands in New York. He can't find anywhere safe. And David Ruggles was like, you know, stay in my closet. You're fine. He was a mentor to Sojourner Truth. He was just an amazing, amazing man. Not a lot of people have heard of him today. Not a lot of people talk about him. I don't understand that. But he advocated civil disobedience. Yes! When fighting back against oppression. He was so cool. And he founded the Vigilance Committee to defend black New Yorkers from being sold south. And he worked with everyone. He worked with white people, he worked with black people, he worked with feminists. Whoa, he worked with like women, crazy. He worked with all kinds of people, and he just wanted to further his cause. He was such a nuisance to the corrupt system, as far as the police and judges were concerned, that he was directly targeted for kidnapping on multiple occasions. They were like, kidnap that guy. That guy. Like, we don't want him around anymore. And he was like, I'm David Ruggles, you can't kidnap me. He was amazing. So an excerpt from the first annual report of the New York Committee of Vigilance reads as follows. This meeting, being impressed with the alarming fact that any colored person within this state is liable to be arrested as a fugitive from slavery and put upon his defense to prove his freedom, and that any such person thus arrested is denied the right of trial by jury, and therefore subject to a hurried trial, often without the aid of a friend or counselor, we hold ourselves bound by the golden rule of our Savior to aid them to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. I love that guy. And then following that, the committee makes their resolutions, and I use several of their real names and 7 for a secret from the people who are part of the New York Committee of Vigilance according to that initial roster, including Brown and Higgins. Brown and Higgins were both actually in the New York Vigilance Committee. So I will read a little bit from this book, and then I'd like to hear what you would like to hear, because I don't know. I'll just read a bit from the prologue, because again, spoiler free. So, the crime victim who is consulting Timothy on this occasion, and I've turned in the manuscript for the third one in the series. They all start with a girl making a journey, every one of them. There's a lot of weird resonances in these books. They all have exactly 27 chapters. That wasn't on purpose. They all start with a woman making a journey, or a girl making a journey. So Bird Daly in the first one, she's running for her life, she's covered in blood. This is the woman who's making the journey in 7 for a Secret at the beginning, is Lucy Adams. Can I describe her properly, as she was before I came to know her secrets? I suspect not. If secrets are gems to their owners, to be cradled in dark cases, I plundered Lucy Adams' jewel chest, thorough as a highwayman despoiling a carriage. It hurts to be a thief, when what you stole was a person's history. I am not that man. I loathe being that man. People, all manner and persuasion of people, want to tell me things of their own accord. Always have done, since I was a barman, even before. But I can't stomach knowing secrets without an invitation, a wave of the hand to walk inside. So what did she look like, this mystery of mine, before I laid bare the story carved into her before we met? Lucy Adams was dressed for winter so simply that every garment announced its high quality. The toe of one boot, keeking out from swirls of a cobalt velvet day dress, was soaked through with snow. So she'd quit the house hurriedly, without donning rubber overboots. An ivory ermine cape around her shoulders had been tied with a violently asymmetrical red bow, and a score of other things about her that evening pleaded for help. White leather gloves gaping, their pearl fastenings loose. No hat, not even a lace cap, for decency's sake and not warmth. Just wave after wave after wave of pinned-up chocolate-brown hair and the tightest corkscrew curls I've ever seen, with white snowflakes melting tenderly into them. Something horrible had happened to her. I didn't need a barman's sleight of hand to realize that. Lucy Adams' eyes were the color of lichen on a stone wall. Mossy flecks of green shot through the gray, and they stared wide as if she'd just been pitched into the Hudson off a steamer deck. Mr. Peast and I stared at her, shocked. Her lips were very full, very round, and she peeled them open to speak as if the motion agonized her. She was beautiful. That part of the story is impossible to discount. It matters, unfortunately. She was one of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" I found my tongue at last, leaping to my feet. "I need a policeman," she said. "It's all right. Here, sit down," I said as Mr. Pease scurried to pour her a tumbler of water. She seemed not to see the chair until I offered my hand, and then she went like a marionette with a novice puppeteer. "We can help." "I pray so." Her racked voice was deeper than her willowy frame suggested. It sent a shiver down my neck, as if she could open her throat and cast ships into rocks. Christ knows enough ships were lost that night, in the storm, packed with New Yorkers who never came home. That wasn't any of her doing, of course. Most would say it was luck, or fate, or even God's. But I can't help but think of her voice that way now, the way it tugged a man, could wrench a steamer off course into cruel shoals. You can certainly trust us to try, I said gently. Just tell it to me like a story, and I'll fix this. Her eyes met mine. They'd gone pale as slate. There's been a robbery. What's been stolen? I asked. My family, she answered me. It's a really cheerful story. It only gets cheerfuler.